The morning sun filtered through dusty windows of Murphy's roadside diner, casting long shadows across worn linoleum floors. The smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee filled the air as the usual crowd of truckers, locals, and early commuters grabbed their breakfast before hitting the road. In the corner booth, an old man in a wheelchair sat quietly, methodically cutting his eggs with the same precision he'd once used for far more critical tasks. His weathered hands bore scars that told stories he never shared, and his flannel shirt hung loose over a frame that had once been solid muscle and unshakable resolve. Before we dive into what happened next, I need to ask you something. Have you ever judged someone by their appearance, only to discover you were completely wrong about who they really were? If you've ever underestimated someone or been underestimated yourself, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness will change how you see every quiet stranger you pass on the street. Frank Morrison had been coming to Murphy's every Tuesday morning for the past 3 years, ever since he'd moved to the small Nevada town to be closer to his daughter. At 72, he'd earned his peaceful breakfast routine, though the other patrons barely noticed him. To them, he was just another old-timer in a wheelchair, probably living on disability and Social Security, taking up space in the corner booth. They saw the wheelchair first, the gray hair second, and never bothered to look deeper into eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. The diner's regulars had their own routines too. Betty, the waitress who'd worked there for 15 years, always brought Frank his coffee black with an extra side of wheat toast. She was one of the few people who bothered to make conversation, asking about his daughter's nursing job or commenting on the weather. The truckers nodded politely if they made eye contact, but most were too focused on their phones or their next delivery to pay attention to the quiet man who never caused any trouble. Frank preferred it that way. After everything he'd been through, everything he'd done in service to his country, anonymity felt like a gift. He'd spent decades being someone that others depended on for survival, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for his teammates. Now he just wanted to eat his breakfast in peace, read his paper, and maybe exchange a few pleasantries with Betty about the grandkids she was always worried about. That peaceful morning routine was shattered when the door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. 6 bikers strutted in like they owned the place, leather jackets gleaming, boots heavy on the floor, voices loud enough to wake the dead. They weren't the weekend warrior types who dressed up to feel dangerous on their Harley rides through suburban neighborhoods. These guys carried themselves with the swagger of men who'd never been told no, never faced real consequences, never learned that respect isn't something you can demand through intimidation. The leader, a mountain of a man with arms covered in tattoos and a beard that hadn't seen a trimmer in months, scanned the diner like he was marking territory. His eyes lingered on Frank for a moment longer than necessary, and something in his expression shifted from casual arrogance to focused malice. Maybe it was the way Frank didn't look away, didn't show the automatic deference that the biker was used to commanding. Maybe it was just that Frank represented everything these men had never been and never would be, quiet dignity instead of loud posturing. Well, what do we have here?" the leader announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet diner. "Looks like Grandpa's taking up a whole booth all by himself. That doesn't seem very considerate, does it, boys?" His crew laughed on cue, the kind of forced laughter that happens when people are performing toughness rather than actually feeling it. Frank continued eating his breakfast, his movements steady and unhurried. He'd faced down armed insurgents in places whose names were still classified, had stared death in the face more times than he could count, and learned long ago that the loudest threats usually came from the most insecure people. These bikers were just another version of the bullies he'd encountered throughout his life, men who mistook volume for strength and intimidation for power. The biker leader wasn't used to being ignored. He swaggered over to Frank's table, his boots clicking against the floor in a rhythm designed to announce his approach and build tension. The other patrons in the diner began to shift uncomfortably, some looking away, others pulling out phones to either call for help or record what they sensed was about to become an ugly confrontation. "Hey, old man, I'm talking to you." The biker leaned down, placing both massive hands on Frank's table hard enough to make the coffee cup rattle in its saucer. "You deaf or just rude? Because where I come from, people show respect when their betters are speaking." Frank looked up slowly, his gray eyes meeting the biker's stare with a calmness that was somehow more unsettling than any angry response would have been. "I can hear you just fine," he said quietly, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who'd learned to stay calm under pressure. "I'm just trying to eat my breakfast in peace." The response clearly wasn't what the biker had expected. He'd probably anticipated fear, deference, maybe some stammering apologies that would allow him to play the magnanimous tough guy in front of his audience. Instead, he was faced with someone who treated his intimidation attempt like a minor inconvenience, no more threatening than a fly buzzing around the table. "Peace." The biker's voice rose, and his crew began to move closer, sensing that their leader was escalating the situation. "You think you deserve peace, taking up a whole booth when paying customers need seats? Maybe it's time for you to move along, Grandpa. Find yourself a park bench where you belong." The cruelty in his words was designed to cut deep, to hit every stereotype and assumption about elderly people, about disabled people, about anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of worth. Several diners looked away in embarrassment, uncomfortable with the public humiliation they were witnessing, but unsure how to intervene against 6 large men who clearly weren't interested in reasonable discussion. Frank set down his fork with the same deliberate precision he'd used to set down his sidearm after countless missions, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of assessment that had once been used to evaluate threats and calculate responses in situations where mistakes meant body bags. But instead of responding to the provocation, he simply reached for his wallet to pay for his unfinished breakfast. That's when the biker made his fatal mistake. Interpreting Frank's restraint as weakness, he reached down and grabbed the old man's flannel shirt, twisting the fabric in his fist and yanking hard enough to pull Frank forward in his wheelchair. The violence of the gesture sent Frank's coffee spilling across the table, and the sound of the cup shattering against the floor rang through the suddenly silent diner like a gunshot. But it wasn't the broken cup that made everyone gasp. It was what the torn shirt revealed. There, etched deep into the weathered skin of Frank's chest, was a black dagger tattoo that every person with military knowledge would recognize instantly. The distinctive blade design of the Navy SEALs, inked with the kind of precision that spoke of brotherhood, sacrifice, and achievements that most people couldn't even comprehend. And underneath that dagger, in stark black numbers that seemed to burn against his skin, was the number 247. The biker stared at the tattoo, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. "What the hell is that supposed to be? Some kind of prison ink, old man? You think a stupid tattoo is going to scare us?" But Frank's voice, when it came, carried a weight that made everyone in the diner lean forward to hear. "That number," he said, his eyes never leaving the biker's face, "represents every enemy combatant I eliminated in service to my country. And that dagger is the mark of the U.S. Navy SEALs Team 6. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the coffee pot bubbling in the kitchen. Team 6, the most elite special operations unit in the American military, the men who took on missions so classified that their existence was barely acknowledged, who operated in the darkest corners of the world to keep people like everyone in this diner safe while they slept." The biker's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning recognition that he might have just made the biggest mistake of his life. But pride and momentum carried him forward even as doubt crept into his voice. "You expect us to believe that? Some washed-up old cripple in a wheelchair was some kind of super soldier?" Frank's expression didn't change, but something in the atmosphere of the diner shifted. It was subtle, like the moment before a storm breaks, when the air pressure changes and animals start seeking shelter. "I expect you to finish your breakfast and leave me to finish mine," he said simply. "That's all I've ever wanted." What none of them knew was that in the far corner booth, a man with graying temples and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses had been watching the entire confrontation unfold. Mike Patterson had been a communications specialist in the Army for 12 years before transitioning to civilian life as an IT consultant. He'd never served with SEALs directly, but he'd supported their operations, knew their reputation, and recognized both the tattoo and the bearing that no amount of age or disability could disguise. While the bikers continued their harassment, growing bolder as they mistook Frank's restraint for weakness, Mike was quietly sliding his phone from his pocket. Not to call local police, who might take 20 minutes to respond to a rural diner, but to dial a number he'd kept in his contacts for emergencies just like this one. A direct line to the Norfolk Naval Base, where he still had friends who understood the brotherhood that bound all military personnel together. The conversation was brief and coded, but the response was immediate. "Location confirmed. Birds in the air in 15 minutes. Maintain visual on our asset." Mike tucked his phone away and settled back to watch, knowing that these bikers were about to get an education in what it meant to disrespect someone who'd bled for the flag they probably claimed to honor. The bikers, meanwhile, had grown increasingly aggressive as Frank's calm responses failed to provide the fear and submission they were used to generating. They were feeding off each other's energy, each trying to prove he was tougher than the last, escalating their verbal abuse and physical intimidation in a way that was making other diners genuinely frightened. "You know what I think?" the leader announced to his crew and anyone else listening. "I think Grandpa here is living in some kind of fantasy world. Probably got that tattoo in prison and made up some hero story to make himself feel better about being a useless old man. What kind of tough guy ends up in a wheelchair eating alone in a crappy diner?" The words hit their mark, designed to strip away dignity and reduce Frank to nothing more than the sum of his visible limitations. It was psychological warfare at its crudest level, the kind of attack that worked on people who hadn't spent years developing the mental discipline to separate their self-worth from other people's opinions. Frank's hands remained steady as he reached for his napkin to clean up the spilled coffee, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said quietly, and for the first time, there was steel in his voice. "But that's not your fault. Most people don't understand what real service means." The biker leader leaned closer, emboldened by what he saw as Frank's defensive response. "Real service? Like sitting in a wheelchair feeling sorry for yourself? Like taking up space that working people need?" He gestured around the diner, as if he spoke for everyone there. "Maybe it's time someone taught you about respect." That's when they heard it. Low at first, barely audible over the ambient noise of the diner, but growing stronger by the second. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades cutting through morning air, the deep rumble of heavy engines, and underneath it all, the sound that made every veteran in a 50-mile radius look up from whatever they were doing. Military aircraft. Multiple aircraft. And they were getting closer. The sound grew from a distant murmur to an unmistakable roar as two Black Hawks swept low over the diner, their downdraft rattling windows and sending dust swirling in the parking lot. Behind them came the ground vehicles, 3 black SUVs moving in perfect formation down the rural highway, their tinted windows hiding their occupants, but their purpose crystal clear to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The bikers froze, their bravado evaporating as they realized that something way beyond their understanding was happening. These weren't local cops responding to a disturbance call. This was a military operation, coordinated and precise, and it was converging on their exact location with the kind of efficiency that spoke of serious training and unlimited resources. The SUVs pulled into the diner's parking lot in a coordinated maneuver that left no room for escape, blocking every exit while maintaining clear fields of fire. Doors opened in perfect synchronization, and 8 men in tactical gear stepped out, their movements crisp and purposeful, their faces hidden behind dark glasses and professional calm. They weren't rushing, weren't shouting, weren't displaying any of the aggressive posturing that the bikers had been using to intimidate Frank. Instead, they moved with the quiet confidence of people who were so comfortable with violence that they didn't need to advertise it, so skilled at their job that they could end any threat before most people even realized there was a problem. The team leader, a man in his 40s with the bearing of someone who'd seen combat in multiple theaters, walked through the diner's front door like he owned the place. His eyes swept the room in a practiced assessment, cataloging every person, every exit, every potential threat or complication, before settling on Frank with an expression of unmistakable respect. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room automatically pay attention. "We received reports of a situation requiring our attention." His gaze shifted to the bikers, who were now huddled together near their table like schoolchildren caught in the principal's office. "I trust there's been some kind of misunderstanding here." Frank looked up at the team leader and gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement. "Nothing I couldn't handle," he said simply. "But I appreciate the concern." The team leader's expression softened slightly, showing the kind of genuine affection that exists between brothers in arms who've shared experiences that most people couldn't imagine. "With respect, sir, handling things isn't your job anymore. That's why we're here." He turned to face the bikers, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Gentlemen, I believe you've been harassing one of our brothers. Someone who served this country with distinction in places and ways that are still classified at levels you don't have clearance to understand." His tone remained conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made his words even more menacing. "I'm hoping this was just a case of mistaken identity." The biker leader found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than the confident bellow he'd been using to intimidate Frank. We didn't know. We were just talking. Talking, the team leader repeated, as if testing the word to see how it tasted. Is that what we call putting your hands on a disabled veteran? Because where I come from, we call that assault on a decorated service member, which happens to be a federal crime with some very interesting penalties. One of his teammates stepped forward, holding a tablet that he'd been consulting. Chief Morrison, Navy SEAL Team 6, 3 silver stars, 2 bronze stars with V device, purple heart with cluster. 47 confirmed eliminations in Afghanistan, 93 in Iraq, 107 in operations that remain classified. He looked up from the screen. Says here he was medically retired after taking shrapnel while covering the evacuation of a captured intelligence officer in Syria. The recitation of Frank's service record hung in the air like smoke, each medal and commendation representing months or years of the kind of service that required sacrificing everything normal people took for granted. The bikers stared at Frank with expressions of growing horror as they realized they'd been tormenting someone whose little finger had more courage and honor than their entire crew combined. So you see, the team leader continued, his voice still pleasant and conversational, this isn't just about disrespecting an old man in a wheelchair. This is about disrespecting someone who earned his rest through service that you couldn't comprehend in your wildest dreams. Someone who literally bled for your right to sit in this diner and eat breakfast without worrying about suicide bombers or sniper fire. Frank raised his hand slightly, and the entire SEAL team immediately focused on him with the kind of attention that subordinates give to a respected superior. That's enough, he said quietly. They didn't know. Most people don't, and that's the way it should be. But the team leader shook his head with genuine regret. Sir, with all due respect, ignorance stopped being an excuse the moment they put their hands on you. We have protocols for situations like this, and those protocols exist for a reason. He pulled out a satellite phone and dialed a number while maintaining eye contact with the bikers. Colonel Davis? This is Alpha Team Leader. We have a situation involving harassment of retired Chief Morrison. Yes, sir, Frank Morrison from Team 6. He listened for a moment, then nodded. Understood, sir. We'll wait for your call. While he was on the phone, the rest of his team positioned themselves around the diner with the practiced ease of people who'd done this kind of thing in much more dangerous circumstances. They weren't threatening anyone, weren't pointing weapons or making aggressive moves, but their presence filled the space with an undeniable authority that made it clear who was in control of the situation. The phone conversation was brief, and when it ended, the team leader approached the bikers with an expression that might have been sympathy if you looked at it from the right angle. Gentlemen, I've just gotten off the phone with someone whose job it is to keep track of people like Chief Morrison. People who've given everything in service to their country and deserve to live their remaining years in peace and dignity. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. Now, I'm told that 3 of you have outstanding warrants in Arizona for assault and battery. Mr. Johnson, he pointed to the leader, you also have some interesting connections to a motorcycle club that's currently under federal investigation for drug trafficking. Mr. Peters, his finger moved to the second biker, you're currently on parole for armed robbery, which means any new criminal charges will send you back to prison for a very long time. The bikers' faces had gone completely white as they realized that their casual decision to harass an old man had somehow triggered a level of scrutiny that was revealing every skeleton in their respective closets. This wasn't local law enforcement running license plates and checking for outstanding tickets. This was federal intelligence being deployed against them with surgical precision. Now, the team leader continued, I could have you all arrested right here, right now. The assault charges alone would be enough to put you away for a while, and I'm sure a more thorough investigation of your activities would turn up all sorts of interesting federal violations. But Chief Morrison is a better man than any of you deserve. He gestured toward Frank, who was watching the proceedings with the kind of calm detachment that comes from having seen real justice dispensed in much harsher circumstances. He's asked me to give you a choice. You can apologize right here, right now, in front of everyone who witnessed your behavior. You can mean it, and you can commit to treating veterans, disabled people, and anyone else you might be tempted to bully with the respect they deserve. The alternative hung unspoken in the air, but everyone in the diner understood exactly what it was. These weren't local cops who would give them a slap on the wrist and send them on their way. These were federal operators who had resources, authority, and a commitment to protecting their brothers that transcended normal law enforcement boundaries. The biker leader looked around the diner at all the faces staring back at him, at the SEAL team members who stood ready to make his life infinitely more complicated, at Frank Morrison who was offering mercy he clearly didn't deserve. For the first time in years, maybe the first time in his life, he was face to face with consequences that he couldn't intimidate, bribe, or swagger his way out of. "Chief Morrison," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want to apologize. We had no idea who you were, what you'd done for our country. There's no excuse for how we treated you, and I'm ashamed of our behavior." His crew followed suit, each offering their own stammered apologies, their tough guy personas completely evaporated in the face of real authority and genuine consequence. They weren't performing anymore, weren't trying to maintain their reputations in front of their friends. They were just scared men who'd realized they'd made a mistake that could destroy their lives. Frank listened to each apology with the same calm attention he'd given to their earlier threats. When they were finished, he nodded slowly. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "But understand this, respect isn't something you give only when you find out someone's credentials. Every person in this diner, every person you meet on the street, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. Not because of what they've done, but because of who they are." The team leader gestured toward the door. "Gentlemen, I suggest you finish your breakfast somewhere else. And I strongly recommend that you spend some time thinking about Chief Morrison's words. Because if we hear about any similar incidents involving any of you, our next conversation won't be nearly as pleasant as this one has been." The bikers practically ran for the door, their earlier swagger replaced by the desperate urgency of people who'd just dodged a bullet they never saw coming. Their motorcycles roared to life in the parking lot, and within minutes they were gone, leaving behind only the lingering smell of exhaust and the memory of their humiliation. As the sound of their engines faded into the distance, something beautiful happened in Murphy's roadside diner. Betty, the waitress who'd served Frank his coffee every Tuesday for 3 years, was the first to stand up. Then Mike Patterson, the Army veteran who'd made the call that brought the SEALs, rose from his corner booth. One by one, every person in the diner got to their feet, creating a spontaneous moment of recognition and respect for someone they'd overlooked for years. The applause started slowly from Betty, then spread throughout the room until everyone was clapping, some wiping away tears, all of them looking at Frank with a mixture of awe and newfound understanding. It wasn't just about his military service, though that was certainly worthy of recognition. It was about the quiet dignity with which he'd handled the harassment, the grace he'd shown in accepting apologies from people who didn't deserve his forgiveness, and the reminder he'd given them all about treating each other with basic human respect. Frank raised his hand to quiet the applause, uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but recognizing that this moment was about more than just him. "Thank you," he said simply. "But please remember that there are thousands of veterans living quietly in communities all across this country. They don't all have teams of SEALs to call when they're being harassed. They depend on people like you to stand up for what's right, to treat them with the respect they've earned." The SEAL team leader approached Frank's table one more time, extending his hand with genuine respect. "Chief, it was an honor to serve alongside you today. If you ever need anything at all, you know how to reach us." Frank shook his hand firmly, the grip of two warriors who understood each other perfectly. "Thank you, son. But I think I'll be just fine. This is a good community, and I have faith that today's lesson won't be forgotten." As the SEALs prepared to leave, the team leader turned to address the entire diner one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something that I hope you'll remember for the rest of your lives. Chief Morrison served this country with distinction for over 20 years, in some of the most dangerous places on earth, so that all of you could sit here safely eating breakfast with your families." He paused, looking around the room at faces that would never again overlook the quiet man in the wheelchair. "But more than that, you've seen what real strength looks like. It's not about being the loudest person in the room or intimidating people who can't fight back. It's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult, and the grace to forgive people who don't deserve it. That's the kind of strength that builds communities and keeps countries free." The SEALs left as quickly and efficiently as they'd arrived, their black SUVs disappearing down the highway like they'd never been there at all. But the impact of their visit would linger in Murphy's roadside diner for years to come, changing not just how people treated Frank Morrison, but how they treated everyone who came through their doors. Over the following weeks, word of what had happened spread throughout the small Nevada town and beyond, carried by social media posts, local news coverage, and the kind of word-of-mouth storytelling that turns ordinary events into local legends. The story resonated far beyond the immediate community, sparking conversations about how society treats its veterans, about the assumptions people make based on appearance or disability, and about the quiet heroes who live among us without recognition or fanfare. Murphy's Roadside Diner became something of a pilgrimage site for veterans and military families, who would stop by to shake Frank's hand and share their own stories of service and sacrifice. The owner, recognizing that Frank had inadvertently become the establishment's most famous customer, dedicated a permanent table to him with a small plaque that read, "Reserved for Chief Frank Morrison, U.S.N. SEAL Ret, and any veteran who needs a place to eat in peace." But perhaps the most meaningful change came from Frank himself, who began opening up to the community that had embraced him. He started volunteering at the local VA clinic, sharing his experiences with younger veterans who were struggling with their own transitions to civilian life. He spoke at high school assemblies about service, sacrifice, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. The 6 bikers, meanwhile, found that their brief encounter with Frank Morrison and his SEAL brothers had consequences that extended far beyond that single morning. Several of them lost their jobs when employers learned about the incident, their behavior deemed incompatible with workplace values of respect and professionalism. Others found themselves genuinely changed by the experience, volunteering at veterans organizations and learning about the true cost of the freedoms they'd taken for granted. The leader, whose name was Jake Johnson, eventually sought out Frank directly to offer a more comprehensive apology and to ask how he could make amends for his behavior. Frank's response was characteristically generous. Instead of rejecting the overture, he invited Jake to join him at the VA clinic, where seeing the struggles of wounded veterans provided an education in humility and service that no amount of lecturing could have achieved. 6 months after that transformative morning, Murphy's Roadside Diner hosted a special event to honor local veterans and raise funds for programs supporting disabled service members. Frank was the guest of honor, but he insisted that the focus remain on the broader community of veterans who deserved recognition and support. The event raised over $50,000 and led to the establishment of an ongoing program providing job training and support services for transitioning military personnel. The most touching moment of the evening came when Jake Johnson, now clean-shaven and wearing a suit instead of leather, took the stage to speak about transformation, redemption, and second chances. He talked about the morning when he'd learned the difference between toughness and strength, between demanding respect and earning it, between being feared and being honored. "Chief Morrison could have destroyed my life that day," Jake told the assembled crowd. "He had every right to press charges, to make sure I faced the full consequences of my actions. Instead, he showed me compassion I didn't deserve and gave me an opportunity to become a better man. That's what real strength looks like, and it's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Frank listened to Jake's speech from his place at the head table, surrounded by his daughter and grandchildren, fellow veterans, and community members who had come to honor not just his service, but the values he embodied. As Jake spoke about transformation and hope, Frank reflected on his own journey from active duty warrior to small-town civilian to reluctant symbol of dignity under pressure. The evening concluded with a presentation to Frank of a key to the city and the announcement that the street in front of Murphy's Diner would be renamed Morrison Way in honor of his service, and the lesson he'd taught the entire community about respect, dignity, and the quiet heroism of everyday life. But for Frank, the most meaningful moment came at the end of the evening, when a young veteran approached him with tears in his eyes. The man, recently returned from deployment and struggling with PTSD and physical injuries, thanked Frank for showing him that it was possible to find peace and purpose after war, that dignity didn't depend on physical capabilities or past achievements, but on how you treated others and how you carried yourself through both triumph and adversity. As Frank wheeled himself out of the diner that night, past the new street sign that bore his name, past the memorial plaque that honored all veterans, past the faces of people who would never again overlook the quiet strength of those who serve, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of knowing that his example had made a difference that would extend far beyond his own life. The story of what happened at Murphy's Roadside Diner became more than just a local legend or a viral internet story. It became a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, that respect is something that should be given freely rather than earned through intimidation, and that the most important battles for justice and dignity often happen not on distant battlefields, but in the everyday interactions between people who are just trying to live their lives with honor and compassion. If this story moved you the way it moved me, I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly because of their age, disability, or appearance? Have you ever stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves, or wished you had the courage to do so? Share your story in the comments below, because every act of compassion and every stand for dignity matters more than you might realize. And if you believe that our veterans deserve respect and support not just on holidays but every single day, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because stories like Frank Morrison's remind us that heroes walk among us in the most ordinary places, and the most extraordinary thing any of us can do is treat each other with the dignity and respect that every human being deserves. The next time you see someone who looks different, who moves differently, who seems to be struggling or just trying to get through their day in peace, remember Chief Frank Morrison. Remember that you might be in the presence of someone whose story would absolutely amaze you if you took the time to learn it. The question is, are you paying enough attention to notice, and do you have the courage to treat them with the respect they deserve?